Salam. This is going to be a very special video that I've been meaning to make for a while. And I think it's pretty paradigm shifting, to say the least, really. Only because I think that the value of this time is that as people become more entrenched in their illusions that are fading by the minute, really, we are, as believers, being prepared. Our confidence is only increased, and our awareness of the world is right on cue with the return of ayahs from the Qur'an. So today's video is going to be about discussing the plagues, the signs of Musa brought towards the people of Fir'aun. I want to also compare and contrast with what is mentioned first off in the Bible. And I can make a separate video to add more to the story regarding the hadiths, 10 signs. Interesting that they both chose 10. And probably after that, I would have to present some research on the very, very complex book of Revelation, which I think is all part and parcel with the same story. It's a very pertinent story for us because the way I'm going to frame this is you have to imagine that whatever has happened in history has a tendency to repeat, and that really there's no telling what is in store for us given how much was invested in lying and deceiving and committing this insane hoax and fraud on mankind, so that if something extraordinary is over the horizon, most of humanity is ill-equipped, basically completely just defenseless. So I'm going to start off with just the whole notion behind these three reading materials: the Old Testament, the Book of Revelation, and Hadith, just to show you what might be actually going on with regards to the common elements described. So, first off, Musa. Musa is the most mentioned person by name, period, in the Qur'an. And I think that there's no mistake, there's no coincidence that is the case when apparently the Qur'an is supposed to be about the Prophet Muhammad. If you go into the Qur'an, you're going to find an extraordinary ayah in Surah 73, ayah 15. And it says, إِنَّا أَرْسَلْنَا إِلَيْكُمْ رَسُولًا شَاهِدًا عَلَيْكُمْ كَا أَرْسَلْنَا إِلَى فِرْعَوْنَ رَسُولًا. This messenger is undoubtedly the messenger of the Qur'an. And it says in that ayah directly, a direct simile, comparison with what was sent towards Fir'aun. I thought that this was something that the Bible shows evidence of. In the Old Testament, in Exodus, raise a prophet like Moses from among your brethren. And Muslims today jump to the Old Testament to validate the standing of Muhammad as a prophet according to the Bible. But why would you need to use the Bible when the Qur'an makes that eloquently clear? This is a full comparison. This suggests that this messenger, called Ahmad, is sent just like Musa. And that's probably why Musa is mentioned all over the Qur'an. His story is probably the most captivating of them all for that reason, because it encompasses so much. It's truly like a narrative that is there to end all narratives. And what I mean by that, what I'm getting at, is the story of Moses in the Bible is really just a caricature of what the Qur'an is describing, the conditions, the context, the stakes, the backdrop of what the messenger Musa is tasked with. Obviously, there's some chronological issues, to say the least, in the Bible. But what you just should understand is this is not just a matter of, like announcing to some royal family that, God is real and I believe in him, and then they just move out of the city and, just out of nowhere, the nature kind of destroys this people. It's a little bit more nuanced than that. There is something really prescient taking place in the narrative. And I would suggest that out of the three narratives that provide different details about basically the same scenario, all the elements of the same scenario as with Musa, you're talking about an apocalyptic time in history. Now, what do I mean by apocalyptic? Apocalypse literally means the lifting of the veil. It's when things become uncovered and clear and discernible for people, so there is no excuse as to what is truth and what is falsehood. The cover is off, so it's up to the people to decide where they stand, on which side of history they belong. For the majority in these kinds of stories, it doesn't end well. And that's just a fact of being human. However, if we put all these things together, you're going to notice that they have just subdivided this one story that's been removed of all of its components. And I think the Qur'an is the only book that actually points to every single component as a whole. In the Bible, you have plagues, certain signs, punishments from God, that Moses is the one who carries them out and shows them to people as he's sent to them as their prophet. A lot of those same signs are mentioned as events of, the apocalypse in the book of Revelation. The sea turning to blood, locusts and whatnot. I think even frogs are mentioned. But there's no prophet, actually. There's just an antichrist that rules in this 7-year tribulation period. Which is interesting because the antichrist is called the false prophet from the perspective of the people he's supposed to punish. So, in the New Testament, the prophet is completely removed from the category, or he's just labeled an antichrist, a demonically possessed human that's a sorcerer, that does all these magic tricks, sorcery. This is exactly how Musa is described by the people he's sent to. It has all the same signs, right? And it's supposed to be the end of the world. Whereas in the Old Testament, you actually do see a prophet, a messenger called Moses, sent to a people, showing them these signs. But it's not the end of the world. The stakes are totally different. It's a local event, which really has left, according to the timeline that is given and the location that's given, has left basically zero impact on history. So I think if you put both together, and obviously this would be coupled with hadith that describes all of this as happening in our future with additional signs. Funny, it's the same number, 10 signs, 10 plagues. So that much is clear. And it kind of suggests that if any of this does happen in the future, exactly as the Qur'an framed these things, is necessary there will be a messenger to carry them out. Just like Musa. He's sent just like Musa. Musa also was away from his people for a time, for a period. And he came back to them as well. So there's nothing actually un-Quranic about that. That if he sent exactly like what was sent to Fir'aun, then his life would be very similar to what Musa did. It's a long topic, obviously, because there's many things to discuss, but I just want to focus on the signs, the ayahs regarding what the Qur'an says. And what you're going to notice is whoever authored the biblical texts, and I'll talk about it in another video regarding hadith, but obviously it would apply to hadith as well, but whoever did the authorship of the Bible clearly knows about the Qur'an. And I would argue that it was authored after the Qur'an to create some kind of a misdirection, so that people don't read too deeply into the Qur'an's account. So, one thing I want to add, just so you can elevate what's written there, than merely the imagery that comes to mind when you watch like The Prince of Egypt or these kinds of propaganda films that are just there to limit or cap the visual for what the Quran talks about. Thanks to the Bible, that they've outdone themselves in that regard. But I did find this one interesting little notes on an ayah that's not actually directly related, but I noticed the same word used. And that's Surah al-Jinn, Surah 72, ayah 19. So there's a little note in there in square brackets that reads as follows: crowding on top of each other in the manner of locusts in order to hear him. They may refer to the jinn or to the disbelievers among the Arabs. How interesting is that they use the word locusts to describe a surah by which the jinn received a message from Allah's messenger. Locusts. So, in Surah 7, ayah 133, it says, فَأَرْسَلْنَا عَلَيْهِمْ الطُّوفَانِ وَالْجَرَادِ. Those are the locusts in question. وَالْقُمَّلِ وَالضَّفَادِعَ وَالدَّمَّ آيَاتٍ مُفَصَّلَاتٍ. ayat implies that these are miraculous occurrences. And mufassalat, to describe them, refers that they are detailed. So there's clearly a lot that comes with each of these components. What's interesting about the ayat given to Musa is that in Islamic tradition, it's thought that he was given 9 of ayat. However, the Bible shows 10. And this is something that always concerned me, because the 10th one is ascribed to God in the Bible, and is probably one of the gravest acts of injustice done in the Bible, as it concerns the slaughter of innocent children, particularly the firstborn sons of Egypt, for no apparent reason, actually. And this is something that is the only reason Pharaoh lets the Israelites go on their way. But that one is actually not mentioned in the Qur'an as ayahs from Allah. So I find that pretty interesting, but I'll show you where I think that comes from. But before I get there, I do want to touch upon why these 5 are there. So I think what's very striking, just because, we're talking about, just going to have to use the colloquial translation just for, ease of clarity. But the first 3 of these ayahs are the last 3 mentioned in the surah. So in the Bible, it would be blood, frogs, lice. In the Qur'an, it would be lice, frogs, blood. Now, I'm not saying that they are one after the other. It could be the case that the ayah is phrased as if they are simultaneous, actually. But the order that they are put in the ayah speaks volumes and is definitely deliberate to hint at something. So I did mention that the locusts are thought in tafsir as a metaphor for the jinn crowding around the Prophet as he was giving the message of the Qur'an in Surah Al-Jinn, ayah 19. But the idea is that one of these 5 mentioned signs doesn't really explain why the Bible chose to opt for a hailstorm as opposed to a typhoon or tufan. So it's interesting that the flood is used for tufan, when basically the same phenomenon is used for ghamra, as a deluge. However, and even today the colloquial term for a flood is fayadan, to denote something that fills the space, as in a flood. However, the interesting thing about a typhoon is the fact that, it is something that actually brings hail, that can bring hail. This is not to suggest that the Bible is in any way giving an accurate take of the events, but I think it's problematic for tufan to essentially describe the motion of tawaf with a flood, when clearly the word typhoon came from the word tufan to describe that circular motion of the storm, which actually affects tropical regions. So I wonder if maybe there is some credence to the wind in the Qur'an sent upon other civilizations described as containing frost, sirrun. the idea of a screeching wind or howling wind. Maybe that's probably the counterpart that was remembered as a hailstorm, which in the Qur'an is a typhoon, tufan. We only have 5 of these signs mentioned in the ayah, 7:133. But if you just go back a few ayahs before that, in Surah 7, ayah 130, you're going to find usually what's equated as one of the 9 signs of Musa, which denotes what sounds like a famine, deficiency in fruits from the thamarat, the crops. And this is specifically affecting Ali Fir'aun, Fir'aun's clan. It even seems to sort of hint at the idea of the years in which it occurred. The word sinin, in this case, is definite and plural, which is not very common in the Qur'an. I think it's common in the usage of 7 years in the story of Yusuf, several times actually, and also 300 years in the usage of the companions of the cave in Surah 18. So we have what is described as a pestilence of livestock in the Bible. The Qur'an gives the definitive explanation of what's actually happening to cause that. Naqsin, something that's basically diminished from the borders of the earth. So, interesting that ayah comes first in succession before the ayahs containing 5 of the signs or miracles given to Musa. If you go to the very next ayah, 7:131, it will talk about the mentality of these people to deny Allah, deny the miracles of Allah, deny their messenger Musa as some sort of witch or sorcerer, only for him to show them what they were denying through these transient ayahs. And they are definitely transient because they can be removed in the Qur'an, which is something that actually pans out in the biblical narrative. But that's part of the mercy, is that people get a taste of what's to come, and they have the option to either get on board or can persist in their denial. In 7:131, it talks about how they're, when it comes to them the good, they say this is for us. And when it afflicts them the bad, they ascribe evil omens by Musa. Not to Musa, by him. And the word for evil omens, strangely, comes from the root for birds and flying things. So one of the other plagues mentioned in the Bible that definitely has not been understood is what's known as the flies. Now I'm going to tell you exactly why I think this is the case and why it's no coincidence that the Qur'an in Surah 7, which deals a lot with Musa's story, basically gives us all of the main ayahs, except for a couple ones that I believe are strategically placed in other surahs for a reason. So, a bit of a backstory is that the flies are kind of a conundrum in biblical exegesis because, this kind of, sometimes they put wild beasts, sometimes they put flies, and apparently these creatures would attack only the Egyptians and never the Israelites, as if they can be trained to do so. Well, wouldn't you know, when I went to the Hebrew to see for myself and not just rely on a translation, as most Christians do, I would see the word in there, Arab. I thought that's very odd. I don't think that this would denote Arabs as a punishment. But I was pleased to find out that the same word is used in Leviticus, I believe, to describe non-kosher animals known as ravens or crows. In the Hebrew language, there's a deficiency in the sound of ghain. So usually it's pronounced as arab and spelled as such, not unlike how you have the word ghazza in Arabic, pronounced as azza in Hebrew. So very likely ghurab, ghurabib has to deal with something to do with crows, ravens, black ravens. And that's why I believe this has been mistranslated in the Qur'an in 7:131, because it says ala innama ta'iruhum 'inda Allah walakin aktharahum la ya'lamuna. That literally is the word for bird, not evil omens, not evil omen in 27:47, not evil omen in 36:19, which they tell us is about the mythical town of Yasin, when it's describing the exact same events as what Musa is talked about with Musa. All you need to go to prove that is to Surah 6, Ayah 38, the first usage of the word طير in singular. And it says, وَلَا طَائِرٍ يَطِيرُ بِجَنَاحَيْهِ. Yeah? It says here that a bird flying by its two wings. Unequivocally what it's talking about. So why would they see it as an evil omen? Well, this is how ravens are thought to be today. There's a whole superstition around them as being an evil omen. Of what? I guess that's been lost to history. But I think that there's probably an answer what it is. And I'll try to discuss that later on. A group of crows is called a murder. And a group of ravens is called a conspiracy. Probably for that reason. So interestingly enough, 7:130 and 7:131 are in opposite order in succession in the Bible. So it would put the birds or flies, because they're flying things, that's the joke, before the famine, or what's known as the pestilence of livestock, which actually fits pretty well with the description if you just connect it to Surah Yusuf, where there's this vision of livestock, cattle, as being lean or skinny, and that occurring within a certain period of time, known as the years of hardship. Well, it's interesting that so far in the same surah, practically next to each other, because the only one before those 5 signs are mentioned is the ayah about the people of Fir'aun saying that whatever you bring us, Musa, from a sign, from a miracle, you're just bringing it to bewitch us. And we don't believe in you. Okay? That's what comes in between a total now of 7 signs that are mentioned in the Qur'an, in the same surah, the same story, the same context, that have parallels in the Bible in a totally different order. So, 7 out of the 10, or 7 out of the 9, although the birds one is never actually traditionally put as a plague, even though you can find where that was hidden in the Hebrew, not to mention the Arabic translation of the Qur'an. Or I should say the translation of the Arabic. So what about the others? There is a mention of a supernatural killing of the firstborn sons of Egypt by the angel of death, which is apparently, according to Jews today, the reason why Passover is named as the angel of death passes over, because the Israelites were instructed to put lamb's blood on their doors to signal that that household should not be targeted for unjustifiably unjust slaughter of innocent children, particularly sons. Well, I think I may have found what the inspiration for that was. And as usual, things are inverted, not just in order, but actually contextually as well. The chiefs from the people of Fir'aun, basically they ask him in Surah 7, 127, not too far from this entire narrative, what we've been discussing so far. And the eminent among the people of Pharaoh said, "Will you leave Moses and his people to cause corruption in the land and abandon you and your gods?" He said, "We will kill their sons and keep their women alive, and indeed we are subjugators over them." I just want to highlight the word for subjugation is called qahiruna. This is probably the inspiration for the word Cairo and why it is placed in Egypt today, because Cairo is called in Arabic Qahira. I can get to a whole other discussion about why the word Babylon is in the Qur'an and not Cairo. However, the most important point to take away from this is that Pharaoh is actually talking about killing the sons of Bani Israel. This is something that is highlighted as a intense part of our history as descendants of Bani Israel. And it's mentioned first along the succession of ayahs about the story. But the context is inverted. It's not that God is killing the innocent children of the Egyptians. It's actually that Pharaoh and his clan, and by extension his people, are slaughtering the sons of Bani Israel. That means that this information from Ayah 127 of Surah Al-A'raf is actually an injustice on the side of the villain. But in the Bible, it's framed as God's punishment. So that just disproves the entire holiday of Passover as a whole. Because it's based on something that was inspired by the opposite party, as mentioned in the Qur'an. So now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of those 10 mentioned. And that leaves 3 that I think are worthy to discuss and important to maybe contextualize as why the entire world was thrown into this exercise in the start of this decade. So let me explain now why they are referred to as plagues. I believe that this narrative is so critical to not lose sight of, to not overlook, to not discount as something confined to history. Which is why it comes up in the predictive programming known as Hadith corpus, and obviously Christian eschatology. The same kinds of things discussed. Obviously the Hadith will overlap quite a bit in some areas and not in others. And the Bible will overlap in other areas and omit others. One of the signs regarding the biblical narrative that clearly was inspired by the Qur'an, which is the only reason I even bring it up, is inspired to convey the wrong conclusion so that people are just in a state of learned helplessness when the Qur'an's true version is made manifest. One of those is the days of darkness. And this is actually not mentioned except in allegory. I did actually talk about this more extensively in the Lifting the Veil stream. But essentially the way that they explain this is that there was a total solar eclipse over Egypt in the biblical Moses story. And that's what caused the darkness. It's interesting that eclipses are mentioned in Hadith as well. And there's actually a mention of an eclipse regarding the advent of Yawm al-Qiyamah. So I'm not going to get into the whole, understanding of Surah al-Qiyamah, okay? But that's what Surah 75 is named, so obviously it has to do with all of the ayahs that are mentioned in that surah. 75, 7. فَإِذَا بَرِقَ الْبَصَرُ 75, 8. وَخَسَفَ الْقَمَرُ 75, 9. وَجُمِعَ الشَّمْسُ وَالْقَمَرُ. This is pretty interesting because the swallowing, yes, that's exactly what it means. The swallowing, the moon was swallowed, is describing a new moon. Right before it talks about the alignment or the congregation, the gathering of the sun and the moon, just mentioned. Does that not strike you as imagery of a total solar eclipse, since they can only happen at a key area in the world on a new moon? There are other mentions in the Qur'an. I think the one where it talks about at-tasaq al-qamar, which is described as a full moon, which I think actually would probably hint at something referring to the blood moon. But that's a different discussion. That's because it's the opposite, essentially. It's the highest intensity of a full moon. It can only happen in a full moon. So I find this pretty compelling that, again, all of the extra Quranic elements can only draw inspiration because whoever created these after the fact clearly had some understanding of what's mentioned in the Qur'an. Clearly the Qiyamah would have something to do with the end of the world, wouldn't it? Right? The upheaval. So wouldn't it make sense that if a messenger is sent to signal the apocalypse, if they're an apocalyptic discloser of the disclosure of Allah, then that would be the context that ties everything together. Which brings me to the boils. Boils is poetry for what is literally described as a bubonic plague in the biblical narrative. There is some mention of a disease throughout the Qur'an, although I would suggest that it's poorly understood, but I think it is clearly related, some kind of illness. There's no mention of any germ theory, there's no mention of any vector for that, no virus. However, the spreading of it probably has something to do with just the amount of people that succumb to this illness. Which brings me to what is known as the Black Death, the Black Plague, and the bubonic plague. So the context for this, clearly in our secular concocted timeline, shows elements of the truth only in regards to the medieval framing, the dark age, as it were. And there's everything to suggest that, well, I'm not sure exactly what was the cause of why a third of Europe apparently was killed off. There are many explanations, but I don't think that they are actually convincing without consulting the Qur'an's take on it. But it does seem that there is a painful punishment that is mentioned in the Qur'an that is supposed to affect and afflict, rather, the masses. The very throng of people that are the barrier to this truth being accepted. Although, in the end, I think that it's just part of the story that most of humanity is astray. As it said in أَكْثَرَهُمْ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ. So, one of the accounts is that there were these mists that were spread by cloaked figures. You can find some obscure sources of this. And whoever inhaled these mists would get sick. However, that doesn't make any sense in actuality because there were all kinds of people in vicinity, in the same places that never got sick. But it does explain why isolated places will get sick, as these would be spread through the winds, that they don't actually, they're not blocked by any walls or anything like rats would be. Lice are mentioned as a vector, actually, officially in history. So there's that possibility. And they probably come about in terms of whatever it is that is described as the lice is just in the Qur'an. I mean, it's definitely preserved in history as fleas or lice. And one of the diseases that they cause is called typhus. They don't really teach you this in history, but the last World War, that's something that was very prominent. Whatever it is that happened back then, clearly the whole story concocted around it is just something to be kind of mutashabiha ayah about this exact story. You have a pharaoh or a Führer, and he wants to just exterminate these people deemed as, descendants of Israelites. And so they do that through a gas, some kind of a mist or vapor. Although what actually is the case is that, well, at least from secular sources, and obviously it's controversial, but, so be it, is that there was this epidemic called typhus, which is thought to be caused by lice. And that's why when these people who were admitted to this, false camp, so to speak, brought there on cattle cars, treated as cattle in the official account, called, Musulman in German, their heads were shaved, kind of like what they do at Al-Masjid al-Haram. I know it seems a bit of a tangent, but, bear with me. So the explanation is that their heads were shaved because the epidemic of lice was rampant across Europe, the same exact place where, in its history, there were these fleas that spread this plague, and it actually did lead to death, just like typhus. Well, there is some sort of confirmation, which I don't think is a coincidence in any sense. First off, the similarity of the word typhus to the word tufan probably is the origin of where that came from. The similarity of the condition to have these dots all over somebody, all over their bodies, not unlike buboes for the bubonic plague. I'm not saying this is what it is, but Clearly, these are things to study. Now, of course, buboes are tied to swelling. That's what exactly they are. And the swelling comes from an impaired immune system. You're unable to detox your lymphatic ducts, which is why the buboes would appear in the axilla, in your armpits. They would also appear on your neck, where you have your lymph nodes. And they would also appear the inner part of your thigh, where there's lymphatic ducts as well. But do you know what typhus actually means in Greek? The word typhus means smoke. That's right. It means smoke, haze, stupor. It is literally the word for smoke. Well, guess what? There is a noble messenger, unnamed, a trustworthy messenger that is sent to Pharaoh. And he's definitely unnamed because what I mentioned prior is that the messenger of the Qur'an is sent to Pharaoh. Why? Because, well, he's sent exactly as what was sent to Pharaoh. So the similarity is only in the fact that it's in a time later on, after Musa. That's it. The conditions are going to mirror what Musa experienced in his time, in the former days. But yes, that was the whole point of this disease caused, and it spread like everywhere. It literally means smoke. It entered the term into English in the 17th century. Typhoid fever. So people, just like the bubonic plague, would get this intense fever and chills or whatever it is, and they would die. They would actually die of this very deadly illness. So it was a big reason, and that's why that surah is called the smoke, the vapor, the mist, the fog. I tend to prefer vapor simply because it kind of assumes that it's breathed in. What if the whole darkening of the world, the days of darkness, which, by the way, if you're not aware of, there is a Catholic understanding that this days of darkness, all the technology will fail. There will be no way to light your way except through these enchanted or miraculous candles that are made of a miraculous beeswax. The bees are obviously something very profound in the Qur'an, which I would imagine is hinted at in that story to basically telegraph that the bees will have to return. And obviously, I think some kind of indication of that is that the fireflies have that same glow, that same kind of greenish glow to them in the darkness. Allah talks constantly about taking you out, taking you from the darknesses towards the light, right? And the only people that will have access to these candles made from this blessed beeswax are the believing ones, the ones that are the elect. What if this smoke actually does block out the sun? And what if this, smoke is associated with all kinds of disease, like I mentioned in my live stream, whereby crops fail, things get very cold, like a winter. This ties in a lot of what is described there. Even the idea of volcanic sediment weakening the immune systems of people, especially since Surah 44 starts off with Al-Kitab al-Mubin. The Kitab as it's manifesting. That's what it means. It's Mubin. Manifest. Inna anzalnahu fi laylatin mubarakatin. So clearly it's nighttime. No sun. Sun is gone. Sun is blocked. إِنَّا كُنَّا مُنذِرِينَ فِيهَا يُفْرَقُ كُلُّ أَمْرٍ حَكِيمٍ. The Qur'an is understood to be sent down within a layla. I wonder why. Maybe because this represents an age where the last part of human history before the last day finishes. The full download of what the Qur'an has been talking about the whole time. Amran min indina inna kunna mursilina rahmatan min rabbika innahu huwa sami'ul alim rabbi samawati wal ardi wa ma baynahuma in kuntum muqinina, which of course the people of Fir'aun are not. Now, what's interesting is the introduction of the smoke comes after the mention of people being misdirected, playing games, distracting, yalla'buna, which perfectly describes our time, actually, in a nutshell. So it says, فَارْتَقِبْ يَوْمَ تَأْتِي السَّمَاءُ بِدُخَانٍ مُبِينٍ. So that's what repeats the word وَالْكِتَابَ الْمُبِينَ. دُخَانٍ مُبِينٍ يَغْشَى النَّاسِ. That yaghsha is a complete envelopment. Not unlike the surah Al-Ghashiyah. And it says, هَذَا عَذَابٌ أَلِيمٌ. There is a painfulness to it. So An-Nas, obviously, you watch my videos, are the sort of masses of humanity that most of them, and they represent most of humanity anyway, but most of them are the exact humans that are doomed to hell, which is why everything concerns their denial. They say, our Lord, remove about us the punishment. We are believers. Just like how Pharaoh, he's drowning, he's like, I am of the Muslims. These people actually believe they are believers. And then it mentions a messenger, also mubin. So the smoke is mubin, messenger's mubin. جاءهم رسول مبين. Clearly, in this day and age, people that are part of this masses, by the way, they talk about this messenger as taught, mu'allamun, majnoon. One of the epithets that is given in Arabic culture for the Prophet Muhammad is mu'allim. So this is just the passive participle of that. Inna kashiful adhab qalil. So this is actually echoing the whole account with Musa, how the punishment is removed transiently out of mercy. So what happens right after? What happens is Fir'aun's story enters the scene. In Surah 44, Ayah 17. وَلَقَدْ فَتَنَّا. A trial, a fitna. This is probably, I mentioned this in my older stream about how the fentanyl crisis is just a code word for fitna, Allah. قَبْلَهُمْ قَوْمَ فِرْعَوْنَ. And that's why obviously it's connected to the story of George Floyd, given that, the whole thing around it is a symbolism. Whether it happened or not, all of it is symbolism, because this is how things play out in our time now before the real events. I can't breathe versus Pharaoh drowning, flooding, where you can't breathe. And it says that arrived to them, Rasulun Kareem. That's usually what they call the Qur'an. It's usually what they call the Prophet Muhammad. Obviously, there's no mention of his name. I mentioned that in Surah 73, Ayah 15. But this smoke really explains a lot. Really a lot, because the people that social distanced, stay in your homes, don't go outside, don't interact with people, distance from them, because there's a virus. There's a coronavirus out there. And if you do happen to go outside, don't worry about having a medical mask, something that is in theory only proven to prevent you from, lessen the chance of you contracting a pathogen. Well, just wear anything, just literally anything, like as if there were smoke outside and you just had to kind of go through the fumes of it outside. Why did they just say use a face covering? It could be anything. Could be a face mask, could be a medical mask, could be a scarf, could be anything. As if it's just about some kind of smoke that is already thought to occur sometime in our future. And this is just a dress rehearsal. This was just a live exercise, according to the White House at the time. And clearly, in Islamic history, there's a mention, the word for plague is used as ta'un. Ta'un is used today to refer to needles, injections, jabs. Okay? You have to be injected. Ta'un. And actually, they kind of pride themselves in the Islamic world, but the first quarantine in history was in the Caliphate of Omar, in Islamic history rather, where they had the same types of plagues. You had Justinian's plague, you had the Black Plague, you had this, and it was always blamed on the Muslims, right? When it was concerning Europe. So the Mongols were blamed for it, the Muslims were blamed for it. They obviously just called them all Jews and whatnot, invaders and whatnot, aliens, which is why everything today is all about illegal immigration, aliens, immigrants, to create that mindset that is a prerequisite for the mentality of the people under Pharaoh. So they basically are telling you that this entire thing that they pulled on humanity is about something real. And they just wanted probably to collect data on how much of the population is going to be duped by this real one. I recall the maniac psychopath Bill Gates mentioning, after, right before smirking intensely, that, oh yes, the next epidemic, the next pandemic, that will definitely get their attention. I wonder what he was talking about there. I really do wonder. But I do want to direct your attention to the word qarh. You can actually find this word to not simply be a wound or an injury, but it's actually something, of course, like something to do with the lesions. Not unlike the idea of buboes or bubonic plague. I wonder, why things like cancer are so similar in their presentation as what's described in the past as the Black Death. And probably a great place to end on this entire topic, or at least the introduction to this entire topic, are the ravens. Have you ever wondered why plague doctors, well, this is just put in our history, we don't actually know what transpired at that time, Have you ever wondered why plague doctors dress like crows, like ravens? Why ravens are associated with death other than the fact that they're scavengers and carnivorous birds? Have you ever wondered why the people that survived the plagues were called thieves? And one of the things that is known about these thieves, they just say they pillaged and, stole from the bodies of plague victims. But one of the reasons they never got sick, they say, is because they would have aromatic herbs at all times to purify the air, which at the time they believed that, and probably it was probably true at that time, because there was a punishment from Allah on this place in the world, on probably the world in general, but that came through this smoke, this painful smoke. And so the thieves blend is named after these thieves that would just inherit all the riches of these victims of the plague. Just like it says about Bani Israel in the Qur'an, the Muslims, the people that inherit springs and gardens and treasures. Are they really thieves, or is it just granted to them after the former civilization that was killing and genociding their children was removed? Just completely removed, cleansed from the face of the earth. Is it any surprise that they tell you that the reason the plague doctors wore those masks is because in those long beaks that are supposed to resemble ravens, they had aromatic herbs. Again, no confirmation of that, but it's just something to explain that not everybody was privy to this smoke. Not everybody was affected in the same way. It is a nas that fears it. It is a nas that is afflicted by it. So obviously it is quite the fitna, isn't it? Because the people that are not affected by it are going to be seen with, just intense animosity from the people that are. And they're going to be blamed for it. Just like they blame Jews for poisoning wells and being witches and wearing witch hats. They even have this hat called Judenhute that they put on Jews in Europe, well, who they labeled Jews. And they just accuse them of all kinds of things because the people could not grapple with the fact that God is punishing them for their sins. So everything is just projection from these people. Do you really think maybe it's a possibility that all of the political happenings in the world, all of the rehearsals, data acquisition and collection, all of the political moves that are cloaked to make it appear as something that it's not, all of the, sometimes very overt references to the Qur'an, that I've mentioned before on the channel, you maybe think that it's leading to something, some big secret that they don't want you to know, because it would change the game. It would actually liberate people, empower them to know that, hey, the future is bright. The future is actually bright. It's not supposed to be misery and heaviness and anxiety, although that is kind of the knee-jerk reaction from, just because we're human. Maybe there's something to the fact of, we're supposed to study this book because it has absolutely critical knowledge about our destiny, things that will repeat from the past. I find it interesting that, I'll talk about it in another video in the follow-up, but there is this notion of stinging and stingers. There are these unseen creatures. They're just called locusts. And I did mention in the Lifting the Veils live stream who they could be in the Qur'an. But clearly the word is there, so it demands attention. And they basically sting people that are targeted by them. Notice all these plagues are very intelligently afflicting things, like always the wrong people succumb to them. This actually is super important to understand. Something about the order in which the Qur'an seems to hint these things to transpire again, but this time for good, because it might help contextualize when in our modern history we can expect these things and what they have done to encode or encrypt our history. Basically since the 1700s or so onward. So we have some idea of where we are in the timeline. It's a very uplifting thing to know that of absolutely any scenario that can transpire from humanity and from the divine, everything is taken care of. You have complete trust. Everything is taken care of. The question is, are you confident enough and strong enough to prove you have what it takes to be a believer?